Ebru, today's analyst and Fairfield University's associate professor of history and director of Black Studies, Yohuru Williams, is here now to discuss the ongoing debate and controversy surrounding the shooting of the Florida teen Trayvon Martin. Welcome. Good to have you here.
Good morning. Good seeing you.
Seems the more information we have, the more questions we have on this case.
Absolutely. This case has become very complicated, and we've seen this in other cases involving issues of racial profiling, police brutality, and certainly acts of violence against African-American youth. We got very little information February 26 when this first happened. As more information becomes available, it's complicating the stories, but not necessarily in ways that are impeaching Trayvon Martin's character, which is one of the main issues now that seems to be percolating over the edge.
That people are coming out and now questioning Trayvon Martin and his background.
Yes, and again, blaming the victim, so to speak, in this case. The most recent report is that he was involved, he was on suspension from school for a drug violation, even though the violation seems to be pretty minimal, and Trayvon's actual involvement in it is questioned. So again, this whole issue of linking things that have nothing to do with what happened on that evening and Trayvon's character to the shooting itself.
What do you make of this almost a return or a backtracking in racial relations here in the U.S.? You had that big protest over the kids in Louisiana, I believe it was about a year ago, the black kids versus the white kids on college campus down there, big protest. Then you had the Sean Bell case in New York, the shooting, people coming out in the protests there. And again, that maybe a disparate treatment by police. Is there a turning back of the clock here?
Well, you know what I think, Brian, is that this is something that is just beneath the surface, and so we see these visible signs of progress in other areas. But in terms of issues involving incarceration and violence, there's been a pretty steady inconsistency in American society and culture. When we talk about Trayvon Martin, we can look at Sean Bell, as you mentioned, or Patrick Dorsman, Timothy Stansbury,
sure.
Oscar Grant. I mean, the list of
Diallo,
exactly.
A number of cases.
Abner Louima. So, and in every region of the country. So it's not just Florida. It's also New York. It's California. So we have a real problem here that lawmakers need to address. And the proper remedy isn't laws like stand your ground or stop and frisk. It's more progressive and enlightened legislation that tries to deal with protecting individuals and not allowing people to feel unsafe in their person if they're going out to do everyday chores.
You know, part of that is that thought process that we need extra protection. You know, just a week ago, you had the white youngster that went to jail, went to prison. He and a group of young white teenagers decided after a party to go out and attack a black man, and they did in a parking lot of a hotel and killed him. It just happened to be caught on tape. He was just convicted last week. But again, it's the mentality that we need extra protection here in America.
Well, I think so, and we saw this immediately in the aftermath of the Civil War when Congress passed an 1870 Enforcement Act, and part of the provisions of that act were to defend African Americans against violence from extra-legal organizations, illegal organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. Now there is no organized Ku Klux Klan, but we're still seeing acts of violence perpetrated against people of color in this country, black and brown, Latinos, Muslims. So we really need to focus on this, deal with this issue. This is really not about a hoodie. It's ultimately about race. And people want to make the connection that this is about Trayvon Martin's sense of fashion, a choice of fashion. That's wrong.
I think that it's pretty clear that it appears that law enforcement dropped the ball. But what about different conflicting media reports? We were just having this discussion before in the newsroom, and how different people said, well, I didn't realize, I thought Trayvon was trespassing. I heard that. And how different media reports are contributing and complicating this case and inflaming it.
This is part of the problem, Laura, is that there's been a steady stream of communication, but it's been really a drizzle rather than a complete story. So what we're getting are bits and pieces, and they're coming in waves that are reported by partisan news outlets. So unfortunately, we're not getting the full story. The police were not necessarily forthcoming in the beginnings of this investigation. They shared very little. Zimmerman wasn't arrested, obviously, and so that raises issues about his culpability, his guilt. But ultimately, the problem is that we don't have enough information, that we don't know everything in this case. What we do know is that we have that cell phone call that seems to exonerate Trayvon Martin, and we certainly have the reputation of the shooter in this case, who called 911, I believe, more than 40 times, 4 dozen phone calls to 911. So he really appears to be a vigilante in this sense, and Trayvon Martin, again, appears to be an innocent victim here.
There are certainly conflicting accounts of what's legal, what's not. We're going to have that debated, I'm sure, in a courtroom. But one thing that stands out was his 911 call when he talks to the 911 operator about following this guy. The law there, that specific law that's so controversial, doesn't even come to play in there. That's when someone approaches you. This guy followed the kid.
Right.
So it seems to me that this stand your ground law doesn't apply here.
Well, if it does, interestingly enough, it applies for Trayvon and not necessarily for the shooter in this sense. The most recent information is that the shooter claims that Trayvon Martin attacked him, that he hit him, but he confronted him first and said, "Why are you following me?" So Trayvon Martin may have been invoking, if that's true, and again, we don't know if that's true, Trayvon Martin's invoking stand your ground.
And that gets to the point that there's so much information, and there's also criticism of local media. Why did they not immediately cover this thoroughly?
I assume, and it's unfortunate, that everyone, including the Sanford police, thought that this was going to blow over, and that it's really metastasized into this national issue because it resonates with so many people. When President Obama says memorably last week that Trayvon Martin could have been his son, I think that resonates with African Americans, people of color across this country. Every generation has had to deal with this type of incidents of violence. It was Emmett Till in the 1950s that some people argue galvanized the civil rights movement.
Sure.
Certainly in more recent memory, you've got Yusuf Hawkins in New York. Again, we talked about Sean Bell. So this is just the latest in a string of cases that forces us to contend with this issue of racial bigotry and how it plays out in law enforcement.
A lot of people getting involved, and it's certainly a complicated case. We thank you for your insight and analysis.
Always great seeing you guys.
Okay.